all manner of information. It was my job as the central place for this to be, well, we don't use the word in Washington anymore. But if you promise not to tell anybody I used it, we were tasked to be accountable, accountable for looking through that stuff, writing it up if it was important enough for the president. And since I worked in the Soviet Union, very often it turned out that I'd write something up, get it through my bosses, and my bosses didn't review it for, whether it was politically correct or anything like that, just to review it so that people, when they read it, they could understand it, and so that was pithily written. And so that's the good news. I was able to do that, and I would seek other opinions from other agencies in government that had to do with intelligence, but I was not required to say anything other than what I thought and what my bosses thought. Pretty heady stuff. Now I'm going to reveal a trade secret here, but again I have to pledge you to complete secrecy. This is not to leave this room, says he with his microphone on here. People say, well, how can you possibly be able to analyze what's going on in the world if you don't have secrets, if you don't have classified information? How can you know what's going on? Well, the secret, folks, is that 80% or more of the information you need on any country or issue is available in open media. Now, there are exceptions to that, but for the most part, 80%. Now, that's a pretty good percent. So these days, and it's available immediately, these days I can go down to my computer at 6 o'clock in the morning and do my little thing. By 8 o'clock, I know as much as I would have by 6 o'clock in the evening out of my old wooden inbox, okay? Sometimes you can get a satellite photograph or an intercepted message which can really give you a good insight, but most often, particularly on things like policy matters with respect to Iraq and other things, you can do it out of the information that's already available. Now, we didn't know when we retired that we would be turning these tools, and the tools, there's a nice word for it. It's called media analysis. You know what media analysis amounts to? Again, it's sort of a trade secret, but all you do is you keep track of what people say, and how they differ. And if somebody says something in April and they say something different in August, you got a story. You got to figure out why. So, why do I mention this? I mention this because in February of 2001, Colin Powell, at a press conference in Cairo, Egypt, said, and I quote, Saddam Hussein does not have any weapons of mass destruction. We have been able to keep them from him. He's not even a threat to his immediate neighbors. February 24th, 2001. He was Secretary of State. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Assistant to the President, said on the 29th of July, 2001, 29th of July would be about 6 weeks before 9/11, okay? She said, and I quote, we have been able to keep arms from Saddam Hussein. He's not even a threat to his immediate neighbors. Okay. Then 9/11 happened, and as we all know, are you with me, folks? As we all know, after 9/11, yeah, right, but what's the catchword? After 9/11, everything changed, right. So we're being asked to believe when Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney got up and said, Saddam Hussein has all manner of weapons of mass destruction and is a threat not only to his immediate neighbors, but to us. We were being asked to believe that weapons of mass destruction descended like manna from heaven for a soft landing on the sands of Iraq, where Saddam Hussein never got the word that our oil was buried there by some terrible mistake that God made by putting our oil under the sands of Iraq. Yeah, it was really pretty bizarre, folks. And guess what? Did you see that in any newspaper? Did you hear that on any radio or TV broadcast? I guess they just missed it, folks. I guess the press just missed it. And if you believe that, then I have a bridge in Brooklyn that I'd really like to sell you at a cut-rate price. Press didn't miss it. How could you miss something like that? And that's this is the most important factoid that I've learned in my 45 years of watching stuff in Washington. We no longer have a free press in any real sense of the word. And that was demonstrated very vividly by how the press cheerleaded for a war that they should have questioned from the outset. Is it possible to believe that nobody looked up the statements of Powell and Rice before 9/11 and compared them with the statements after 9/11? It's not possible for me to believe this. Is it possible to believe that several reporters did and that their editors didn't let them put it in the paper? Yeah, it's a little bit more possible for me to believe. That's what we're facing, folks. And that is a real big change. That's a sea change in the body politic. I'll mention one other factoid while I'm on it that is of transcendent importance, and that is, and you all will have to deal with this more than I will, the world is running out of oil. I'll say it one time more. The world is running out of oil. Production has sort of peaked. Consumption is going way sky high, especially in China and India. And this war in Iraq can justifiably be regarded as the first of the resource wars of the 21st century, because it has to do with oil. So unless we get a little bit smarter about how we negotiate with one another and how we face this problem, there's going to be more and more violence and more wars. Now, the way this all got translated into action was that the president very soon after 9/11 decided that this was a really golden opportunity to go after who? Say again? Saddam Hussein, yeah. But Saddam Hussein, was he on one of? Did he send one of those 19 hijackers sent by Saddam Hussein? No. Huh. What did he have to do with 9/11? Anybody? Nothing. Yeah. So what did the president try to do? Well, sometimes you have to sort of get firsthand accounts of these things to be credible. But I don't know how many of you have read Richard Clarke's Against All Enemies. How many have? Just to show. Okay. Well, it's really a good read. He was the terrorism czar for both Clinton and early Bush. And Against All Enemies, does that ring any bells? Where did he get that title from? Just shout out. We're informal around here. Against All Enemies, what's that from?
Against All Enemies, Foreign and Domestic.
You got it. Okay, and what's that from? Yeah, it's from the oath. Not only the president. I took that oath as an Army officer and as a CIA employee. We all take it. To defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so it was very well chosen, Clarke writing this, Against All Enemies. Let me just read a little section here. He talks about the president's reaction to 9/11. I'll read that one too. On the evening of 9/11, you may recall that the president spoke before gave a speech to the nation. That was at 8:30. At 9 o'clock, he gathered Clarke and Rumsfeld down in the little bunker that they had been in earlier. And he said this, quote, this is from Richard Clarke, who was there, okay? The president. I want you to understand that we're at war now, and we'll stay at war till this is done. Nothing else matters. Any barriers in your way, they're gone. This is our only agenda. Again, Clarke. Secretary Rumsfeld noted that international law allowed the use of force only to prevent future attacks and not for retribution. Bush nearly bit his head off. No, the president yelled in the narrow conference room. I don't care what the international lawyers say. We're going to kick some ass. The following evening, the president is seen wandering around alone in the White House Situation Room. Seen by whom? Seen by Richard Clark. The president, this is Clark, the president grabbed a few of us and closed the door to the conference room. Look, he told us, I know you have a lot to do and all, but I want you as soon as you can to go back over everything. See if Saddam did this. See if he's linked in any way. I was once again taken aback, incredulous, and it showed. But Mr. President, Al-Qaeda did this. I know, but see if Saddam was involved. Just look. I want to know any shred. Absolutely, we'll look. We'll look again. I was trying to be more respectful, more responsive. But you know, we have looked several times for state sponsorship of Al-Qaeda and not found any linkages at all with Iraq. How many Americans believed that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11 when we attacked Iraq? How many? What percentage do you suppose? It was 69%, folks. Why? Because of the president and everybody else put it in the same sentence or consecutive sentences. Never saying that Saddam Hussein planned 9/11, but it was always Saddam Hussein was connected with it. And there was a parallel intelligence agency of sort set up under Don Rumsfeld in defense. See, my CIA colleagues stood tall on this one. They pored over all that evidence and couldn't find any convincing reports that there was any symbiosis or any real relationship between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, so they wouldn't say there was. Now, this happens in industry as well. When you can't get the answer you want from the bureaucracy or from the established institution, well, it's often the practice that you do what? What's that?
Seek a second opinion.
Yeah, seek a second opinion. And how do you do that? Well, you get a couple people who you think might be a little bit more interested in being promoted than telling the truth, and you put them over in a separate part of the building, and you make it clear what answer would be better, and by golly, they come up with the answer that you'd hope for. Now, this has happened in CIA under Bill Casey, but it also happened in the Pentagon big time. It's the Office of Special Plans, headed by Douglas Feith, and the Pentagon, the Department of Defense Inspector General has just completed an exhaustive study saying that, in effect, Don Rumsfeld, the Vice President, and Douglas Feith set up a parallel intelligence organization, a small one, but good enough to manufacture support reports, to rejigger reports, and serve them up to the President saying, and to the Congress, saying that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. You know, I've seen a lot of pretty cynical stuff in my 45 years in Washington. But, you know, playing on the very real trauma that we all felt after 9/11, to associate somebody who had nothing to do with it, Saddam Hussein, with it, you know, it's about as bad as it gets. Let me just say a couple of things more, and then I'd like to spend a lot of time on questions. When we saw all this happening, we retired intelligence types. We were really aghast. You know, we had not seen this before on the part of our own government. Had our own government disregarded our advice? Sure. Had it, had it honestly made mistakes? Sure. But never had we seen a government meticulously build a case for what the Nuremberg Tribunal after World War II called waging a war of aggression. Now, they defined that really carefully. At the end of the trial, they said that a war of aggression, to initiate a war of aggression is to commit the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes only in that it contains the accumulated evils of the whole. Accumulated evils of the whole. Like what? How about torture? How about kidnapping? How about putting people in black holes and keeping them there without telling their wives or their families or of the Red Cross? How about all that stuff? How about listening in on our conversations against federal law and the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution? Accumulated evils of the whole. That's what we were watching. And so we turned our little media analysis techniques onto our own government. And before the war, we published 3 memos, just set up just like we used to do. Memorandum for the President, subject, Colin Powell's speech today, and the date. We told the President after Colin Powell's speech that we gave him an A for performance and a C- for content. Now, if we knew then what we know now, we would have flunked him outright on content, right? Okay. A lot of it was manufactured, most of it was exaggerated, and it was all pretty much all wrong. But at the end of that memo, we told the President, look, we said, Mr. President, we strongly advise you to broaden the circle of your advisors beyond those who are clearly already bent on a war for which we see no compelling reason and from which we believe the unintended consequences are likely to be catastrophic. It was a no-brainer, folks. It was a no-brainer. And Scott Ritter and others were shouting from the, Scott Ritter was one of the UN inspectors, a U.S. Marine, were shouting from the rooftops, there aren't any weapons of mass destruction there, okay? There aren't any meaningful ties between Iraq and al-Qaeda. So the war was waged for different reasons, Why was the war waged? What do you think? Aha, good. Spell that out.
Yeah, no.
This is the guy that almost killed my dad, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah, okay. Anybody else? What else? Oil. All right. Okay. Anybody else? Say again? Revenge, yeah. Akin to that. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Justifying the presence for American installations in the Middle East.
Wow, yeah. I mean, we're the sole remaining superpower in the world, right? We'd be remiss if we didn't throw our weight around. And we're better than the Middle East, where the world is running out of oil, huh? So permanent, sorry, I said permanent military bases. We don't say permanent anymore. The Pentagon's changed the lexicon. They're enduring military bases. Believe me, if all those enduring young military bases, give me a break. What the hell is the difference between a permanent military base and an enduring military base? Well, enduring presumably sounds a little bit more endearing or something. Anyhow, they're big, big things, okay? And they're still there. There's one other reason that I'm sort of looking for that nobody mentions in the press, but it's there, it's big, and it's very relevant. Anybody? Pardon? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Making money? Yeah, all right. There's certain piling up a lot of money, yeah. The other one is Israel. Israel is the elephant in our collective living room. To refer to the Israeli role in this is to be politically incorrect and to leave yourself open to all kinds of invective. But I'm not running for any office, and I don't need any money. And so I'm an intelligence analyst first and foremost, and I'm saying that the Israeli leaders, I'm talking about the right-wingers that were in charge of the Israeli government, found a very sympathetic voice among the neoconservatives in this country. And believe it or not, those folks thought that by waging war on Iraq and getting rid of Saddam Hussein would make that part of the world safer for Israel. Now, I can sympathize with the Israeli people looking at Saddam Hussein. After all, he shot 39 Scuds in their direction during the first Gulf War. Thank God they had no chemical or biological warheads on them. But, you know, that's a nasty thing to do. Would you, if you were an Israeli citizen, would you like to get rid of Saddam Hussein? Yeah, you could understand that. But, you know, there are ways to deal with these problems short of war. And the bottom line, folks, is that now well, let's put it this way. Before the war, how many suicide bombers detonated themselves in Iraq? Anybody know? Anybody?
Didn't hear the question.
How many suicide bombers in Iraq before the war, before we invaded? None. Zero, folks. How are they encouraging terrorism? Well, I'll tell you. They let Abu Nidal or somebody like that stay there until he died, and a couple other high-level terrorists were allowed to have sort of house arrest there. And the other thing they did, and I don't condone this at all, was to pay off the families of suicide bombers, the ones that blew themselves up in Israel. Now, again, I don't condone that, but that was the limit. That was all that Saddam Hussein was doing. Now, let's look at the situation in Iraq now. Any terrorists there? Any suicide bombers? Oh, yeah. Any danger to Israel? In spades, folks, in spades. So not only were these folks sort of myopic, they were downright crazy in thinking that were we to attack Iraq and it to be seen as part and parcel of our partnership with Israel, that would make that part of the world safer for Israel. It did just the opposite. Now, why is this relevant today? Okay, we're thinking about withdrawing from Iraq, right? Now, why is that factor relevant today? Anybody? Because the situation in Iraq is a great disincentive to withdrawal in terms of Israel's real interests, because the place is teeming with terrorists now. Israel's much more vulnerable, in my view, than at any time since 1948. And so the people running our policy, which are by and large the same ones that got us into Iraq, are very understandably reluctant to pull us out. And that's a big factor. Now, let me just say a word about the weapons of mass destruction. We talked about the ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. It's forgery, if it's traced back, can be seen right at the doorway of the Vice President of the United States. This was a report that said that Iraq was seeking uranium in Niger, and of course the only reason they'd be wanting uranium would be to build a atomic bomb. What's this look like? A mushroom cloud, right, yeah. And so on the 7th of October, 2002, the President said, and I quote, "The first sign we might have that Saddam Hussein has a nuclear weapon could come in the form of a mushroom cloud." 8th of October, Condoleezza Rice says the same thing. 9th of October, Victoria Clark of the Pentagon said the same thing. On the 10th of October and the 11th of October, your congressmen, your senators, and mine voted to allow the President to start a war for which there was no reason at all. Doesn't get any worse than that. Now, are there any saving graces here? Yeah, there's a saving grace. There was one organization that performed pretty well. It was the State Department intelligence types, okay? They were working for General Powell, but he didn't pay any attention to them, but they stood their ground. And as they were doing the estimate, this national intelligence estimate on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, I used to chair these things, so I know how it goes. You go around the table and say, okay, State, or you say Defense, what do you say? How soon can you get a weapon, a nuclear weapon? 7 years. Okay, CIA, 6 years. NSA, 6 years. State Department says, well, you put us in a very difficult position because you're asking us to predict the completion of a program that we don't think has been restarted. It reminds me of my favorite cartoon. Our middle daughter was studying history at the University of Virginia, and she sent me this cartoon. It's a BC dad standing up on a rock, okay? And he's got this tablet in his hand, and it's clearly a report card. And his daughter is cringing down below there, you know. And the caption says, "Oh, great. History, F. You flunked something, didn't even happen yet." Thanks. I just think it's a great cartoon. A few people agree, but I'm satisfied with this reaction. What's my point? The State Department was being asked to predict the end of a program. Didn't even happen yet, you know. And they stood their ground, and they came off smelling like a rose. As for the forgery about Iraq seeking uranium in Niger, I mean, there were so many things wrong with that. It was false on its face. Number one, Iraq didn't need this. It already had this kind of uranium in Iraq. The problem was not getting it. The problem was refining it to a more refined grade. The uranium that's mined in Niger is controlled every ounce by an international consortium headed by the French. There ain't no way that Iraq was going to get. And so the analysts, to her credit, threw it in the circular file, okay? Then they found out that it was based on a forgery. It's sort of like, you may be too young to remember Yul Brynner in The King and I, but at one point he stands up and he says, "So, it's a false lie." Yeah, that's what it was, you know, false on its face and based on a forgery. Now, let me just end with confessing to something that I used to be ashamed of. I am angry as hell. I'm thinking about those 3,300 plus young men and women, your age most of them, who are dead now because of all this. I'm thinking of the 650,000. I exaggerate not, folks, the 650,000 Iraqis who would be alive today if it weren't for this war. Now, that's a joint estimate by a British medical publication, The Lancet, and Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And British government officials looked into the methodology and have given it a clean bill of health. That's a lot of people, folks, 650,000. Not to count the 2 million Iraqis who have emigrated, have left the country, and are lying around in camps in Jordan and Syria and other places. Now, when I was growing up, we had this little thing in the Bronx about being angry. It was frowned upon. And it was okay, you know, if you're angry for a couple hours or even a day. 2 days was getting close to the limit. Well, if you were Irish, they'd give you a whole week, you know. But I found myself, right after we were unable to prevent the war and so many other people were unable, just getting angrier and angrier. And luckily, I remembered something I learned in school. This might be a little encouragement to you. Sometimes, even at some distance, you can remember some stuff that you studied in school. Now, at Fordham, where I went, it's a Jesuit university in New York, we had to study a lot of Thomas Aquinas. You know, and you know, Thomas was, you know, he's pretty naive on some things like women. You know, he just didn't know anything about that, so his remarks are really stupid about that. But he was good on some things like virtue, you know. And I remember learning about what Thomas said about the virtue, I say again, the virtue of anger. See, Thomas bought that old Pythagorean idea that virtue's in the middle, you know, so too much of something no good, too little also no good. And he complained bitterly that in Latin, the language in which he wrote, there was no word for the virtue of anger. And so he cited John Chrysostom from the early church, 4th century church, who said, "He or she who is not angry when there is just cause for anger sins." He who is not angry when there is just cause for anger sins. Why? Because anger Respici bonum justitiae. Anger looks to the good of justice. And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are unjust. And then Thomas added his own little corollary to that, and he said he railed against something he called unreasoned patience. That's the best translation we can do from the Latin. Unreasoned patience. And what he said was, unreasoned patience sows the seeds of vice, nourishes negligence, and prompts not only evil people, but good people to do evil. Unreasoned patience. How much unreasoned patience we see in this country